My aim here is to do a quick gestural sketch of this flower. It's actually the Australian waratah. It's the state emblem of New South Wales, where I live. Now, the idea is that it's going to be a fairly quick drawing, but I thought to make it interesting, I'll show you 3 paintings I did of this same flower, not this particular flower, but of this flower when I was painting in the years before I began drawing. So I say that also to make clear that I'm very comfortable with the rather complex composition of these flowers. So you'll notice that first off, I do a quick dotted line around the outside of this central body of stamens. And then I do some more dotted lines that kind of swirl from the top and spiral outwards. And these are to give me some guidance. They're not guidelines, but they're just to give me guidance of the sort of direction I want these bands of stamens to reflect. Now, this line part of the drawing, before I do any hatching, this line part took me just 11 minutes to do, and I've sped it up to 8.5 minutes. So you're looking at 1 1/4 speed. So this is close to the speed I drew. And at this point, I'm just trying to get the stamens in place. And I know that it's not until I put some of the darker areas in between them and underneath them that it's going to kind of pop into any presentable appearance. So I'm just trying to make sure I capture the effects of the swirls, and then you'll see that these lower stamens have actually split open, and there's a thinner, in fact, the actual stamen coming out, that the upper ones are really encasements of the stamens, and then from the bottom up, as they develop, they split open and the real stamen comes out. So a waratah that's in full bloom is quite a complex series of forms, and even when it's just part and part as it is here. I'm using a Copic 0.2mm pen, although this is probably going slow enough that you can read everything that's on the pen. And as you can see, I'm holding it some distance back from the end, and that's the more gestural a drawing I'm doing, the more brisk and looser I want my lines to be. Even in a case like this, where there are lots of them quite close together, I find the further back I hold my pen. And so, happy with kind of the general pattern that I'm creating with these stamens. And I'm also happy that I've been filling out the dotted shape that I created to basically fill. Now, you'll notice I am, though, not agonizing over any one stamen. I am keeping my finger in the camera, not because I like to show you how probably terrible my fingernails are, but because I actually want to just be drawing the right row that I'm looking at. And so I am doing it just to help me locate what I'm doing very quickly. But in fact, I still am just drawing the effect of all of these stamens massed together. And that's where I think it's practice that develops the skill of working out just how much detail to draw to create the effect we want in the time and for the sort of look for our drawing that we want. And now around the edge we have these, I think they're called sepals, and these are the same colour as the waratah. Waratahs can be anything from a deep bluey crimson, deep dark bluey crimson to a really bright, almost scarlety orange colour, and flashes of several. And these sepals, some of them as the plant develops start to curl back under, but they do create this wonderful red framing, and you can see that the flowers are very dark green, which is also a great contrast. And in the bush, these waratahs stand out when they're in bloom. And the plants that they're on are often 4, 5, 6, 7 feet tall. So I'm trying to capture, again, not the exactness, but the feel. But the sepals I draw, I want them actually to have a sense of reality. So while I'm not labouring over an exactness, I am wanting to capture the way they curl and they shape and they indent. Because when I do the hatching, I'm going to want to indicate some of the indents that way, some of the tension points in the curves. So now I've pretty much done the flower, and we can't really see the stem because it just happens to be almost completely hidden behind our leaves. Now, waratah leaves can be slightly different depending what variety of waratah we're looking at. Some of them have a toothier edge to the outside of the leaves than these ones. We just have a few fairly blunt teeth on some of these leaves. And some of the leaves are completely rounded, but they're all this very long, fairly thick sculptural form. They have a definite center line and they bend upwards in sort of a V shape on each side of that center vein. So again, it's capturing that bending, that folding, if you like, over the central vein. That's one of the things we want to capture. And we also want to capture the fact that because they're also fairly wide, depending again how they're bending, some of them are tilting and even bending over completely. And we're also seeing some of them more or less flat on, but others we're seeing more edge on. Now, another important thing when we're doing leaves such as this, where we are drawing each leaf individually, is that where the leaves go behind other leaves and we get glimpses, pockets of parts of leaves or leaf stems, we want to make sure that pretty much all the time they do genuinely join up with a leaf. We don't want to start just doing little bits of crisscrossing leaves unless we're drawing the whole leaf, because it will just in the end come across as disconnected. So you can see here with these leaves that while I'm not going into any great detail with them, I am actually paying a lot of attention to the form. And the reason why I'm able to do it in 10 minutes is because I have painted so many of them and I've studied these leaves of this particular plant so much. So there's probably, for someone who's not so familiar with the plant, a little more observation. But as I said, I'll show you 3 of the waratahs that I've painted afterwards, and you can see how some of the other varieties look. There are actually waratah shrubs as well, where we can have enormous bushes, 3 meters high, covered in a flower that's very similar to this one, just not quite as robust or as compact as these, if you like, more individualized ones. So I'm pretty much done with the line work. So now we're ready for the hatching. Now this hatching took 20 minutes. So all in all, it was pretty much exactly 30 minutes to do this quick sketch, which in my mind is a fairly brisk sketch for a subject that's as complex as this. But I've made this hatching probably about 3.5 times actual speed, because otherwise there is a lot of just watching me draw lines. If you want to see it a bit slower though, don't forget you can use that cog icon on your screen to slow down the speed by up to half speed. So that will bring it down to just under double speed, which might give you a better chance if you want more detail as to what I'm drawing and how I'm drawing. So you'll notice I'm starting with really the shadows between the sepals and the stamen parts, and I'm wanting to define now some of these shadows. So drawing these with negative space, I'm certainly relying as much on my painting memories of these flowers as the actual reference. So I'm working over a relatively large area all at once rather than getting bogged down in trying to go too hard in any one spot, because I'm not exactly sure just how dark I want my darkest areas to be and what the line work for those will be, and therefore how I'm going to do the line work relative to that in other parts. And there's also the fact that all of these sepals and the rest of the flower are all red, and the leaves are a darker local colour as well. So I'm going to want to give the effect somehow that the leaves are darker, but I do have a 0.2 millimeter pen, so it's not particularly large or wide, and this is meant to be a brisk drawing, so it does want to have a sense of speed in the capture of the form. So I start by just looking at some of the shadows on the leaves as being a starting point. And at first I thought maybe I'll leave the leaves blank and I'll just do the shadows. But I ended up thinking that that may not just read in an obvious way, and it may also confuse the leaves with the sepals, where I've done the same thing. I've left them as white paper, except where there are shadows or shade on them. And so I'm thinking I'm probably going to have to do hatching on all the leaves to represent the colour. But one good thing about these leaves, as I mentioned earlier, is that they are fairly sturdy, stiff, sculptural-like leaves, and they do form this V shape, albeit still with a bending, twisting motion around the central stem, around the central vein. And so that gives me a nice form to follow with my hatching lines. And that lets me create, if you like, a very different feel for these objects as opposed to the other objects that are red above them that are relatively similar if we look at them just as outlines. So I've reconciled myself now to the fact that I'll be doing lots of hatching, and so I start to make it very quick. I don't think I've ever hatched so much so quickly. But I feel like the effect that's being created is working, and so I keep going. And when we have forms such as this and we're hatching them, the important thing, I think, to consider is when the hatching of different forms are adjacent to each other to create a different value, to have one of the forms darker than the other. So whether it's the form that's sliding behind or whether it's the form that's coming over the top of another, we don't want them to end up having the same value, the same grayscale effect, if you like. We want to help create visual distinction and contrast and interest and separation by having them different values, having one lighter or darker. And with these leaves, I mean, this really is about the flower head, this drawing, certainly in my mind. So we want the leaves to be there because they're part of the, if you like, the experience of the bush. But the bright red, the round pom-pom ball, it does and should capture the eye in life. And so in the drawing, I still want that to be the central point. So I'm happy that if the leaves read at a glance as lots of separate leaves, but where no one leaf particularly jumps out at us and grabs the attention because of its form or its darkness. So this is where we're trying to create a balance, a rhythm, and a consistency in our line work so that we can manipulate an overall effect. You know, I want the leaves not to be a tangle of lines, but I'm happy for them to be a tangle of leaves. And so that's the separation I'm trying to create. And you can see here now where I'm starting to define some areas as darker than others. I am watching the clock at this point, and I have set myself 20 minutes for the hatching as a reasonable time. And then I have to pause and look at my reference and ask, okay, so where are the darker parts? And what parts are darker because it's simply shade, it's where the light's not reaching them, or where it's shadow being cast by something above it. Now you might notice that in the lower right corner, I actually simplified the drawing somewhat. I leave out some of the leaves because I felt that it would perhaps become too much of a blodge of shapes. I wanted to have a little more separation between some of the leaves just to create a stronger sense of leaves. So this is where we're not a slave to our photo, and we're not so much improving the photo as just making it work better as a drawing, where we have some limitations as well as some strengths. So now just going back to some of the original earlier parts and just thinking, is there anything that in these last seconds of this drawing, this hatching, bearing in mind that I'm not wanting to start labouring over parts because this is a brisk sketch. I do want this to have a sense of, well, considered haste. What do you think? Well, let's have a look at those 3 paintings that I talked about earlier, and you can see how this looks, for me anyway, as a painting. So here's a cluster of 3 waratahs together, painted to look as though they're in the bush, of course, although in reality they were 3 bought cut stems that were in a vase. This is, of course, just a photo because I have sold all 3 of these paintings. The second one, this is actually from a photo of a waratah bush that was growing looking like this. The only difference was it was in a national park and it had been sprayed with blue paint by the rangers, which is sadly enough one of the measures they've been forced to do to stop people stealing them, cutting them and stealing them, and of course therefore denying the area the seeds to germinate in the future. You'll notice here that the underside of the leaves is a much different lighter green than the more upward facing side of the leaves. And here we have another variety again, and here we have the more consistent toothed edging of the leaves, and leaves of a very different colour, a far more bluey green effect with the leaves here. We also see here that all of these, if you like, cases of the stamens have broken open and the stamens are all coming out, and they glisten on the end with a tiny drop of nectar which very much attracts the honey-eating birds. And in some of the sunlit areas you can see some of the variation in colour that the underlying green pigments in the leaves can create under different weather conditions. And here we have the wonderful colours of the new growth. And here we have the actual only waratah painting. Look, it's 3 dimensions that I have because I haven't quite finished it. This was what I was working on when I switched over to drawing. I feel like they have a very Christmas feel from both their shape and their colours. I feel like this looks like a big fancy Christmas ribbon and bow stuck on top of a present. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Waratahs have been a huge part of my art practice because, well, I've painted so many. They probably were my most popular subject with my paintings. And this is the first one I've drawn, and it's been a lot of fun to apply the observations and some of the skills I developed painting them, drawing them. But certainly a very different challenge with a brisk sketch. Look, I hope you have a go drawing it. It's not straightforward, but you'll find the photo on my channel community page, of course. Why not have a go? Hey, you can paint it if you work with paints as well. But look, whatever you end up doing, whatever you draw, whatever you paint, however you hatch it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.